Welcome to another episode of the Building Your Career podcast. Today, I am super keen to have on Anna Beckett, the Associate Director from Buro Happold. Very, very excited to have her on, particularly to hear about her journey as she's progressed up to Associate Director, and talking about some quite interesting topics that I know a lot of our listeners have specifically asked for as well. So, Anna, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, very nice to be here. Thank you.
So I suppose we'll start off where we always start off. Could you tell us a little bit of, give us a little bit of an understanding about what your background is and how you got to that level, and particularly where your interest came from in the sustainability and what you've actually done to be involved in that in practice as well?
Yep, I can do. I kind of ended up doing structural engineering by accident a little bit. It was not what I'd applied to uni to do. I'd applied to uni to do maths because I was good at maths. And things sort of didn't go to plan in my last year at school, and I ended up in a situation where I knew I wasn't going to get my first choice, and I think it made me think about it all a little bit more. Through that process, I thought about what I actually was interested in, and I started looking at architecture courses, and I think I should have really known that I was interested in buildings a little bit more. Like we'd had a family holiday where we went to Greece, and I was absolutely fascinated by like Epidavros and Olympia and all these really old structures. And I have two sisters, and neither of them were in any way interested at all. But yeah, so I started looking at architecture courses, and I hadn't done art, so architecture wasn't really an option. And I found this architectural engineering degree. So I changed course on results day, which is a little bit stressful, but worked out fine in the end, and it was the best decision I ever made. I loved my degree. It was 90% structural engineering with a module each year, which was an architecture module.
Mm-hmm.
And it was great, and I really enjoyed it.
Sorry, just on that note, could you just talk us through, because I know a lot of our listeners were considering if it should be a pure structural degree that they should go down or an architectural engineering degree. So can you just actually explain, exactly what those architecture modules were all about and how that kind of helped on the architecture and design side?
Yeah, I mean, I think you get quite different things. There are several unis now that offer architectural engineering degrees which have varying amounts of architecture in them. Mm-hmm. And some universities, like I know Sheffield's course, you come out with both degrees, an architecture degree and an engineering degree, and I imagine they have a lot more architecture that they do than what I did on my degree. For mine, we did I think 1 or 2 modules each year that were architecture specific modules. In my first year, that was definitely like a history of Western architecture module where we looked at lots and lots of different buildings and different periods in time, and general architectural principles around how things have been built at different points in time. We did a project one year where we actually looked at the layout of a building and how you might set that up and how you wanted your rooms to be spaced out and how much space you needed for different things. Mm-hmm. We did a architectural philosophy module one year, which I'm going to say was maybe not the right one for and people with an engineering mind. I found that quite difficult. Like some sort of things around like the gender of buildings and things, which were interesting, but we then had to write an essay at the end of it, and it was quite difficult. Quite a lot of us who were mathematically minded, I think. It just gave us sort of a flavour of the architecture side of it. And if you were somebody who was interested in architecture, it was a really good kind of counterbalance to the maths side. So my degree is an engineering degree, but I did study this little bit of architecture as well. And I think it really depends which uni you go to, how much of that you get on those courses, and if it's something that someone was interested in, I would recommend reading about specifically what is involved, because they're not all the same. And there's quite a lot of variety, I think.
Okay, brilliant. And then obviously after the university, then you kind of progress your career from then on in, really.
Yeah. So during my degree, I did a placement year where I worked for Arup in Cardiff, and I did some structures and I did some drainage design. And then I did a master's year as well, which is where we did a project, which again, we did a bit of the architecture side of things in that as well. And then I started looking for jobs, and I graduated at exactly the wrong time at the back end of the recession, and there weren't any jobs anywhere at all. So I had a year where I didn't start working. I did a variety of other things. I had a lovely temping job where I sold loft insulation, and I went and travelled in Australia and New Zealand for a bit, and then I did another temping job where I was working at a company that sold steel plate, which actually turned out to be very useful because I learned a lot about how you test steel and steel testing certificates, which has come in handy over the years. And then I wrote to every engineering company that appeared on Building Magazine's top consultancies list. And I had a couple of interviews out of that, but I eventually got my job with Web Yates Engineers. I loved it. It was amazing. It was a really tiny company when I first joined. There were only 10 people, and it kind of meant you got thrown in the deep end a lot, but on a really varied mix of projects, but often working with existing buildings. And I think that has been then exactly how my career has progressed. I've done a lot of work with existing buildings, and I really like working with existing buildings and figuring out what's already there and why it's like that, and who originally used that building. Why did they design it like that? Why did they lay it out that way? And why has it got this random piece of steelwork that's been put in at some other point that who knows what it's doing? But I enjoy kind of unraveling that and searching through record drawings to figure out what's been done to buildings and why. And I think if I'm thinking about how I've ended up now with the work that I do now, which is a lot of on the sustainability side, I think a lot of it comes from working with existing buildings and wanting to understand existing buildings and how you can get more out of them, how you can modify them to do what you need them to do now without really needing to build something new.
And I think you've touched on a really kind of important topic there as well in terms of existing buildings, because a lot of people just deem sustainability to be what can we add on additionally to a new build building, and they don't actually consider sustainability within existing buildings as well. Could you just kind of give us a little bit of an insight in terms of what the process is to be able to consider if the reuse of an existing building is going to be sustainable or not, and how we kind of measure that within the life cycle of an existing building?
Yeah. I mean, I think the first thing that is important to remember is that when you look at sustainability, that is the approach that you're encouraged to take. So you are meant to be trying to not build anything new, make use of what you already have, use less materials. An existing building is already there. Like, unless there's a reason to actually get rid of it, then you should be trying to find a way to work with it. I would say generally the way that you approach existing buildings really depends on what that building is and how old it is. So if it's a building that's listed, then the way that you need to approach it is very prescribed. You have to do certain things. You need to consider the structure in a certain way, and you obviously need to be really careful about what fabric you touch and whether you have the permission to touch that fabric and how you're affecting the building. If you are looking at a building that is a slightly less well-loved building, that's, a derelict, office building or something, then really the way that you would be looking at that building is in terms of structurally, you would be looking at whether or not that structure is in a good enough condition for you to continue to use it, whether it's been damaged, somebody modifying it at some point in time has damaged it through the work that they've done, whether there has just been degradation of the structure over time. So, or in concrete frames, you can often get corrosion of the steel inside the concrete, which blows all of the concrete, and then you might be saying that actually it does need demolishing because the structure is not in good enough condition. And then if you have got good enough structure to keep keep it in place and to keep using it, then it's looking at whether or not you can make that structure meet the needs of the building that you need today. Because ultimately, there's no point in doing some work to try and keep it if actually it isn't going to fit the needs of what we're looking for now, and in another couple of years it's going to be derelict again because it doesn't work with the way that we're using buildings. And there's lots of debate around this and what counts as a good enough reason for demolishing a building, and I think those arguments are quite interesting as well. I think we talk a lot in sustainability, particularly for structures, we talk a lot about embodied carbon and the embodied carbon of buildings, but actually sustainability has to encompass a lot more. And if you look purely at carbon, then you would take one path, but if that building then isn't going to be used, then what's the point? Like you haven't really achieved anything. And sort of slightly older definitions of sustainability take into account the economics as well as the like social factors with that and the environmental ones. And I think you need all three, and we're not very good at that.
And could you just elaborate on exactly what you mean by embodied carbon, just for some of our listeners who might not have come across that phrase?
Yeah. So if we were in any type of project that we're doing, if we're putting in a new piece of steel into that building, then we're talking about the carbon associated with creating that piece of steel. So there's the energy that you need to extract the raw materials. There's the energy that you need to process that and to manufacture it into what you need. And then there's energy associated with things like transporting it and actually getting it into the right place on your site. And all of that sort of comes together to form or to give you a value for the embodied carbon. So it's very similar to things where you might have seen about your carbon footprint when you take a flight. That would be the energy associated with the fuel from the plane and everything that goes with that would be giving you your carbon footprint for that. This is the same thing, but for all of the materials that we're putting into the building, as well as all of the energy associated with the works on site to achieve that.
And I think that's a really important distinction to make, is that it's the whole life cycle of the material, including the transportation to site as well, which a lot of people don't even kind of think about. They just think about, when it's installed, what is the end result? But I really like that that's gone all the way through from what raw materials do you need to make this product, right through the manufacturing process, right through the transportation process, the installation, and then also sometimes after the installation, the whole life cycle afterwards as well, which I find quite fascinating, rather than just looking at something from this is the end result and does this. No, it's so much more than that when we're talking about embodied carbon.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. And actually, then you've got to the sort of part of sustainability that is the bit that I really deal with a lot, which is reuse of materials. So now a lot of the work that I'm doing is looking at ways that we can extract those materials out of a building. So I have projects at the moment which are existing buildings where we're keeping part of the building, but we have part of the building that we're modifying. And so we're looking at how you can take the materials out of those parts in a way so that you can, with very, very little reworking, be able to put them back in again. This is particularly sort of a little bit more developed when we look at steelwork. So steel beams and columns in a building, there is a quite well-defined process now for being able to extract those as a whole element from the building, do some refabrication with it, and then put it back into either the same building or a different building, and reuse that steel element in much closer to its form as it's coming out, rather than what would have typically happened, which is that it would have been melted down back to being just steel and then be reformed into a new piece of steel. So the energy involved in that is much less, but still is not the only thing that you can do this with. And we're starting to see lots of other components in buildings, like things like ceiling panels and flooring and carpets starting to be reused much more, which I think is really interesting. And it's really important for the industry as well to start finding ways to be working differently.
I really, really like that. And I think, that's something that I'm passionate about is when I worked in architecture, a lot of the work that I worked in was in heritage and conservation and the reuse of existing, and something that I found super, super interesting. And I didn't necessarily associate it with the sustainability side of things when I was doing it at the time, but completely realized that it is that kind of reuse of existing, really, which I think is really, really important for people to be aware that that is the best course of action initially, is to see what you can do with the existing rather than demolishing everything and down and starting again. But are you seeing any kind of trends in the market or any changes in the market from when you first started working in the sustainability side of things? Because I know from my perspective, it was very much a case of the kind of maybe the green agenda, as it was called at the time, was very much a case of, well, let's see if we can put some solar panels on the roof, put a wind turbine outside, and maybe have a ground source heat pump. And it was all to do with adding on to existing.
Yeah.
But what have you seen in terms of the differences between, obviously when you first started out in the kind of the sustainability side of things to now? What are the kind of the general differences and trends that you've seen?
I think you make a really good point. I did a sustainability module at university, and that was what we got taught about as well, was like solar panels and ground source heat pumps and things like that. I don't think the term embodied carbon got mentioned at all it definitely never got mentioned in my degree. I don't think it got mentioned at all working until maybe about 2018.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that then probably that the practice that I was working for were a little bit ahead of the curve still on it then. I think that I was lucky in that at Web Yates they very much encouraged us to look at whether we had over-engineered something, like could you actually do it with less material? Did you need steel? Could you do it in timber instead? Could you reduce the amount of concrete you were putting in foundations? Like, were you just being a bit too conservative? Could you push things a little bit harder? And that all came from wanting the engineering to be better rather than necessarily suggesting it for a environmental reason, but it very much then led into that way of thinking. And I think, much more now, it's much more commonplace to be talking about embodied carbon. The Institution of Structural Engineers are very much pushing that and expecting everybody to be doing those calculations for their projects. In Buro Happold, we've got very defined processes for doing that and making sure we're doing it on every project and starting to try and look at ways that we can reduce the embodied carbon on projects. So I think that has very much come to the front of what everybody is thinking about and looking at. I think the circular economy and materials reuse is following on from that, and I don't think that that's as well established in the industry yet as perhaps like the understanding of embodied carbon is. And so hopefully that follows through. And then I think that the next thing that will come behind that is regenerative design, and the idea of actually designing in things in a way so that they're not only not making things any worse, they're actively making things better. But I'm not sure that the industry is quite there yet on that one.
On that one as well.
Idea.
Yeah, and because I know that a lot of people are kind of saying regenerative design currently. When I ask about something that's kind of tangible, there's not really any explanation to what that means. Could you just give us a brief overview of what the thought process is behind regenerative design then?
Yeah, I mean, it is the idea that you should be creating something that is improving things rather than making them worse, or not even making them worse. Not just, instead of not making them. Got my words tangled up there, but instead of not stopping from making things any worse than they currently are, which is I think what we're trying to do, you actually are trying to improve the situation, trying to give something back to the environment. I would say, I think the place where we perhaps have the most scope in the construction industry to start looking at this is in the sourcing of materials and where those materials come from. I think it's something we don't necessarily think about. Mining for Portland stone to make cement is, you have huge quarries that are changing the biodiversity of those areas. And you start thinking about how you do that quarrying and whether you can do something different in that material extraction process, so that you don't have that same impact, and then actually maybe you can do something that is actually benefiting that ecosystem. I think that that's probably the best place where the construction industry can start looking at those kinds of ideas. But I would also say it's definitely not an area that I'm an expert on either.
Yeah.
It is I think it's a difficult subject to get your head around for anybody in the construction industry at the moment.
Well, you're right there in terms of going right back to source. And what I was saying previously is not look at the end result, but look at the source of the issue and kind of solving it from source, really, I think is crucial. But I know you mentioned there the kind of the iStruct and ICE. I know they're doing some really good things in terms of the promotion of sustainability and setting kind of industry standards, really. I know that obviously you went through the chartership process yourself, and it's something that a lot of our listeners are either going through or about thinking of going through. So could you kind of just give us a little bit of an overview about what it was like for you going through the chartership process, how you found things, if there's any particular advice or anything that people should be watching out for when they are going through that process themselves?
Yeah. So I did the Institution of Structural Engineers chartership, and that has kind of, I'm going to say two parts. It's kind of three, really. So the first part is that you have to produce a portfolio where you demonstrate that you have met the objectives that the institution has defined as the things that you need to meet. That used to be 13 objectives. They've adjusted it recently so that those objectives are a little bit better aligned with the Institute of Civil Engineers objectives, so that it's more similar for those chartership processes. But overall, it's still quite similar. You have to have an understanding of the institution. You have to be able to demonstrate that you can communicate effectively. You have to be able to demonstrate that you can produce designs and analysis, and that you have a reasonably high level of competency in that. And then you have to demonstrate you have an understanding of the sort of more practical aspects as well, like health and safety and the actual construction process. It has an environmental part to it where you have to demonstrate that you have you have to demonstrate you have an understanding of embodied carbon. You didn't when I did it. You had more general environmental things that you had to write about. And then it has a part that's more sort of commercial side of things. So demonstrating you have some commercial awareness, that you have some idea about contracts and law and things like that. So you produce a portfolio that demonstrates you've met all of those objectives, and then you have an interview, which is basically checking that you have done the things that you've said you've done, and if there's anything where you haven't quite demonstrated it, you might get asked about that. And then after that you do the institution's exam, which is probably the most sort of epic exam you might ever do. It's a 7.5-hour exam. It's not great, but it is interesting in that I think the process of preparing for that exam does help you to become a better engineer. You sort of learn to have a bit better judgment about things, and sort of be able to make better decisions about what you're looking for. And I do think it's a worthwhile thing to do. whole process didn't go particularly smoothly for me. It was fine for the portfolio and the interview, but yeah, the exam, I failed the exam the first time. And it's quite interesting that you said about what advice I would give. I would say that the first time I went into that exam, I had had so much advice from so many different people that I didn't really manage to judge which were the right things to be taking on board. And so I sort of got to the first part of the question and had all these things that people had told me going around in my head, and it sort of made me think, oh, I have no idea how to do this. Somebody's told me this one thing about this type of question, and actually I don't know how to do that for this type of question. And really, I didn't need to be able to. I should have just done what I thought. And so I think I panicked a bit and changed the question, and that's just, you can't do that. You don't have the time. So yeah, I would say, I'm not saying that people's advice isn't useful. It very much is. But be able to have a think about which things are the right things for you, but also like be confident in what you know, because you probably know a lot more than you think you do, and you should sometimes just go with what you think. But yeah, so the second time I did it, I didn't tell anyone I was doing it, and I went off quietly and did it and passed it and came back.
Right. I really like that. And I like that advice as well, as, everyone's kind of got their own opinion. And you're completely right. If you take on too many people's opinion, then sometimes it is overwhelming, and you can just be bombarded with lots of different opinions. But I think you touched on a really kind of important topic. And I know something that we discussed before is that kind of whole fear of failure. And particularly for me, I know it resonates with me because, if I am faced with like a difficult task or something, sometimes because of the fear of failure, I do go out and maybe ask too many people for advice and then get in my own head and kind of go round and round in terms of, because I am just scared of that failure. But ultimately what I've learned is that, the failure side of things is the thing that you learn the most from, really. So I know, from when we were talking, you were quite big on the kind of the STEM ambassador side of things. We've had Lorian Williams as a guest on the podcast, who's a STEM ambassador, but I know that was something that you were really passionate about, kind of telling people as well. So could you just talk to us a little bit about the STEM ambassador side and that kind of fear of failure aspect as well?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think, I think I probably said this to you, but every time I have made a decision about my career, it feels like it hasn't really worked out. It's gone in a different direction, but I don't regret any of those things actually now. I think I learned something every time. Those things were not necessarily what I expected to learn, but I think it has all worked out in the end. I mean, like my A-levels didn't go to plan. My degree went relatively well, but then there weren't any jobs and it didn't really matter. My chartership didn't really go to plan, and then more recently I moved jobs after I'd been at Webby Yates for 11 years, and it had been my whole career, and I made this decision that felt like a huge decision to move company after that amount of time, and I moved to a really tiny company, which I thought was what I wanted, and actually it was not the right decision for me at all. It wasn't a very good fit, and it felt like this, absolute disaster, because I'd made this huge decision to leave a company that I'd been at for a long time and enjoyed working for, and it wasn't right. But as a result of that, I moved again, and I did that quite quickly, and again that feels quite terrifying to do, to then move again. I moved again after 6 months, but then I came to Buro Happold, and actually it's been brilliant, and I have really enjoyed being at a bigger company and working on some different things. And I think Buro Happold is a great company to work for, actually. They're really interested in things like people's well-being, and they're very good, very inclusive, and that's been really nice. Yeah, on the STEM ambassador side, I've done a lot of sort of working with schools and working with students, and going out and talking to them about my career. And I always talk about my A-levels, and my A-levels not going very well. I think it's very easy when you're in school to feel like things are sort of mapped out. Like, you're going to do your A levels, and then you're going to go to university, and then you're going to get a degree, and then you're going to get a job, and this is how it's going to go. That is how it goes for some people, but for most people it's not. You do something for a bit, and then you do something else that wasn't quite what you were planning to do, and then you try something a bit different. But yeah, I mean, even the job where I was temping selling loft insulation, there were still skills that came from that. I was a lot less worried about ringing people up and asking for something with absolutely no sort of not knowing them or anything before that, because I'd had to do it. There wasn't an option. That's what my job was. So yeah, I think there's nothing to be lost from those experiences. You still learn something from them.
Most definitely. It's all a learning curve. And I think, it's what you said to me as well, is that sometimes people just look at the end result and the perfect version of what's happened, but don't realize the journey that it's taken to actually get to that point as well.
Yeah.
So I think that's quite an important thing, is that, you've got to learn, you've got to fail along the way to be able to get where you're going. So, obviously your background is a testament to that. And I love the way that you're kind of, advising other people as well, particularly the younger generation. Don't be afraid of failure. I think that's a really important lesson there.
Yeah, there's a quite famous quote that is it will be okay in the end, and if it's not okay, it's not yet the end, which I think is that's it.
I love that quote. Well, Anna, I could genuinely sit here and talk to you for hours. I've really enjoyed this episode, and I think it's been super, super insightful, and you've touched on some real key topics that I know our listeners are super, super passionate about. I just want to say thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on as a guest.
No problem. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Anna.